We want our pelvis to be able to move through full range of motion in a few different ways. This includes a pelvis that can go into an anterior and posterior pelvic tilt, a hip that can hike up and be pulled down, a hip that can open up in the backside as well as compress in the backside. What this does is it allows for all the muscles that attach to the hip to be able to move through their full range for optimal control and positioning of the pelvis. The other thing we want to be able to have happen is we want one side to move independently from the other side. This movement and action is needed for such things as walking and running. You can also see with that reciprocal movement pattern how that allows freedom for the sacrum and tailbone to move side to side. So along those same lines, we want that tailbone and sacrum to move independently from the pelvis. Again, this also helps facilitate balance and movement actions in the pelvis and being able to make sure that no area gets left behind in that movement option and variability. Now, sometimes what can happen is that you can get certain parts of the pelvis kind of stuck or glued together. This can be on both sides equally, or it can be on one side and not on the other side. If you have more of the latter, of one side and not the other side, then this can result in one side of the pelvis kind of moving at a different rate than the other side, or a change in resting position that can affect the SI joint and the pubic bone here with it. Now, as I'm demonstrating these movements, we're remembering that this is a model pelvis that's really emphasizing that movement, and it's not really that much movement in real life. However, it's about those intentions and thinking about where we're driving the movement from and what is happening in the exercises that we're doing. So when we think about areas getting stuck, we can think about kind of using a term of thinking about the sacrum being kind of stuck or glued in place. What can this can result in is that when someone goes to do, say, a deadlift or a hip hinge, instead of being able to get length from, yes, their proximal hamstring sum because of their pelvis tipping forward, but also we want the backside of the pelvis to open up to lengthen and load the glutes. If the backside of that pelvis is kind of stuck together, then what can happen is the pelvis moves just as one unit, and maybe you're getting all that movement from the hamstrings, resulting in hamstrings being overly lengthened and abs being more in a lengthened position. So then the pelvis in a resting state is in more of an anterior pelvic tilt. Now, remember, it's not that an anterior pelvic tilt is bad, but we want balance in movements. And if you're always kind of biased to being in more of that anterior pelvic tilt, then we're already into some hip flexion, which can contribute to pinching and impingement in the front side of the hip when we go into deeper ranges of hip flexion. It can also affect how other muscles that attach onto the pelvis can function, such as the piriformis trying to be more of a pelvic stabilizer instead of the glute med. On the flip side, we can think about how maybe you have a harder time lengthening in the proximal hamstring and the lower glutes as a whole. What this might look like is going into your hinge or your squat and kind of tucking under, and particularly in the squat, getting more of that kind of butt wink where you tuck under and then flip back up and out of it into that anterior pelvic tilt, creating a lot of stress and strain more through the lumbar spine rather than driving the movement from the pelvis. So come join me as we explore a little bit on how we feel in these movements, and then maybe how some isolated movements to kind of knock the rust off of these areas that are a little bit stickier can help affect those bigger movements and give you better freedom and ease of making those actions happen. Before we get into our exercises, we're going to do a couple movements to help assess how those movements feel in the moment. Then we'll do our exercises, and then we'll come back and retest those initial movements that we tried out. The idea behind this is it helps you know that your accessory exercises were productive and helpful in creating better movement in the desired areas. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a hinge, and then we're going to look at a split squat. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the intentions behind a hinge and behind the split squat and where we're thinking about we want those movements to look like. But the idea is that, okay, if you're finding that you're just kind of like racking your brain, cueing yourself or your client to death, trying to kind of like make that action happen, maybe some of the accessory work to kind of knock the rust off of those areas that are kind of resisting the movement in the bigger movements can help then just make those bigger movements happen with greater ease. So thinking about, hey, as I go through these exercises and kind of give some cues with good intentions, does that clean it up well enough? If so, great. Maybe you don't need the accessory work. Other times can be like, it's just not quite happening, or I'm having to think really hard. then okay, let's explore the accessory work and then see if it makes you not have to work as hard in those bigger movements. By continuing to move forwards in those bigger movements with those good intentions, that then allows you to keep that kind of theme going that you got of unsticking the sacrum and the other accessory exercises that we're going to do, so that eventually you can break up with the accessory exercises. It's not all about adding more things, right? Sometimes it's about adding and choosing wisely of what we end up doing. So before we get started, I would like you to grab something to record yourself. It's important to be able to look at where movement is being driven from. Sometimes you can think it's happening one way in your head, and then you go to look at a recording and you're like, oh, actually, in reality, this is happening instead. That being said, as we also go to do these movements, I want you to try to think about where you are feeling the movement coming from, because that is also important, okay? It's about the whole picture and not just one or the other. So for our hinge, we're gonna set up with our knees against a chair. As I want to do this, I'm walking my feet underneath the chair and then I'm softening my knees. I'm still keeping my rib cage stacked over my hips. Sometimes I'll see people soften their knees and they'll immediately kind of go into a hinge to begin with. But I want to think about those knees just softening against the chair. Their knees should be right underneath that midfoot, and they should maintain this position throughout the movement, both going down and then back up. Now, as they go into the hinge, we're going to think about sitting back into those hips and that pure horizontal movement. Knees stay just touching that chair, not pushing into it or not pulling away. And then coming back up. Same thing. Knees just gently touching that chair. Now, what can happen is that if people have a hard time getting the movement from their glutes and proximal hamstrings, they can find the movement from somewhere else. Some ways that this might present would be being here, going to sit back, and their knees come back with them. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's going to drive more movement distally from the hamstrings rather than proximally from the glutes and hamstrings. So it all depends about what is your desired goal for the movement. Then people can also try to hinge back, but then their butt kind of tucks under and drops. This indicates that they're getting more length in their paraspinals and getting more of the movement from their spine rather than from their hips and pelvis. They can also have the tendency to not really hinge back, but fold over, getting all the movement more from hamstrings versus getting that opening and thinking of widening those sit bones to load the glutes as they go to do the hinge. They can also turn it into more of a vertical movement where they're sitting back, but they're also sitting down. And this is making them load their quads instead of more of that posterior chain. Lastly, they can drive the movement from their spine by, okay, I can't sit back, but I'm going to try to get down further. So maybe I'm going to flare my ribs forward and getting more of the movement kind of from this high hinge point area and lengthening abs versus staying connected here in that spine and core here and getting more of the movements from the glutes and the hamstrings. So in the end, they might have to think about sitting back into those hips to feel those sit bones widen, but also feeling that pelvis lift up and over the femurs to help them lower down and stay centered over their feet and keep that movement in that pure horizontal pattern. Okay, so gave you some tips to what to think about in a hinge, but thinking about, okay, how hard did that feel to kind of implement? And then what did that kind of ease of making it happen in my body feel like? Did it kind of hit resistance and then have to work around? Or is it like butter and being like, oh yeah, that's just where I needed to have it happen? Then when we go to retest, you can kind of think about, okay, not only what was the end result, but also that path to get there and ease of movement to make it happen. Now, when we go to look at the split squat, we're looking at hips and pelvis, but it's also going to involve what's happening in the knee, in the calf, and in the foot. So if you go to do the accessory exercises here for your hips and the split squat doesn't really get cleaned up, then maybe we need to work on a different plane of motion in the hips, or maybe we need to look further down in the chain at the foot and ankle or the tibia. Maybe we need to look at the ribs. So there's some other areas to consider. But for all intents and purposes of this video, we're considering the pelvis and trying to clean up that area there in one plane of motion. So for the split squat, we're gonna have left foot forward, right foot back. I'm making sure I'm set up for success. So to start with, I'm making sure my hips are square to the front and my hips are level. If I'm here to start, then this isn't really a good position to sit down and into. So really making sure hips are kind of sucked up and in, and level here to begin with. And then that I'm maintaining that orientation of my pelvis throughout the movement as I sit down and then back up. So I'm making sure that, okay, as I go down, hips stay level and square to the front. What can happen is if you have a hard time sitting down, you might sit out to the side instead, which is gonna load this glute med more. Now, if your intention is to load your glute med more there, great, let that hip shift happen. However, if we are wanting to unstick back here, we need to think about keeping this sucked in and driving more of the movement from the restricted area. You can also see how maybe someone would complain of glute med pain, and so they do all this glute med strengthening and they're just not getting anywhere with it. But maybe it's not their glute med's fault. Maybe it's because back here is sticky and they're just doing more reps with that glute med instead of more reps with the glute max and the backside of the pelvis. Now from the side, what we're looking at is as they're here, again, hips staying square to the front, I'm not turning away. And then as I come down, then I'm sitting straight down and back up. How you can be restricted here is that as you go down, if you can't open up, then they will tuck under or maybe flare forward or shift all their weight forward, getting more movement from their spine and their rib cage instead of the movement from their pelvis. Now, we always want to make sure that we're going to look at the other side. One side could be easy, other side could be tricky. Each side could have its own challenges. So it's important to assess what is happening on each side. Along those same lines, when we go to do the accessory work, you're paying attention to both sides being able to do the desired movement. And maybe we need to encourage one side to do a little bit more than the other to help it kind of catch up. It can also indicate that maybe we need to work some more frontal plane or transverse plane being really dynamic, but that is a discussion for a different video. All right, so now that we've done these assessments, making sure you also go and do that right side for me and thinking about not only what does the movement look like, how does it feel, how does it feel throughout the entire point, not just like, ooh, I got down there, but what is that path to get there for it? Let's go ahead and hop down on the ground to try out our accessory exercises and then come back to these bigger movements and see if they move with greater ease. For this first exercise, we're gonna come down onto hands and knees and use the wall to help create tension in our hamstrings as you take your pelvis into a forwards and backwards movement. So we're gonna go here and we're gonna have feet on the wall. You don't have to worry about your heels being on the wall. And we can be on hands here. Now, I do find that coming down on forearms can be really helpful to kind of lock the rib cage in place to help allow for the movement to happen in the pelvis instead of the ribs. That being said, if someone complains of neck pain or shoulder discomfort being on forearms, you can definitely go onto the hands instead. But I'm gonna demo it here on forearms. So here I am with feet on the wall. I'm making sure my shoulders are over my elbows, my palms are parallel to each other, and my hips are right over my knees. If I'm sunk down, I'm gonna give a cue to push through my armpits and kind of lift those ribs up, making sure the center of my chest is still pointed straight down. We don't wanna press so much that then you end up scrunching back like that. So we're lifted up here. Now, we're gonna drag feet up the wall without them actually going anywhere. You should feel some hamstring engagement as you do that. You're gonna use that hamstring engagement to then tuck your pelvis under, rotating it around like a wheel. So it should be some lifting in this area here. Then you're gonna keep that hamstring tension and you're going to let your pelvis tip forwards, going into an anterior pelvic tilt and feeling your sit bones lift up towards the ceiling and widen, still keeping that hamstring tension. As you're gonna do this, you're making sure that you don't collapse in those ribs. So keep those ribs lifted. Then you're gonna tuck under again. So hamstrings drag to keep that sit bones dropping down through the backside of the knees, pelvis rotating under, and then drop in my chest or move in the upper half of me. Keep that tension, tip that pelvis forward, thinking like someone is tapping right at that lumbar spine and top of sacrum to kind of spill that pelvis forward, sit bones widen, tailbone lifts up, tuck back under. So you're just working back and forth here in each direction, using concentric hamstrings to pull under and eccentric hamstrings to lift and come forwards with it. So as I'm gonna do that, you can see how if you cut off the bottom half of me, And just for looking at the top half, you wouldn't even know I was doing that movement down below because the top half is so steady. That being said, it could be sticky back there. So it might be hard to do much movement. So you can kind of think about how your range of motion starts maybe a little small at first, but then as you kind of keep rocking back and forth in each direction, that range should hopefully increase and grow. The idea is that with that tuck under, we're trying to do it without our glutes and without pulling a bunch with our abs, but really calling out those hamstrings. In order to do that, we might need to find some length first, some opening in that pelvis, okay? And then we can kind of come back into it from a fresher place of isolating hamstrings a little bit more. In the end, you should feel those hamstrings working, and it should already kind of feel like everything's a little bit more open in the backside of that pelvis. Now, let's lay down and explore that idea in another move. So now we're going to explore that same concept in a 90-90 position laying down on our backs. Sometimes I find that the hands and knees version can be a little bit easier at first because you're kind of working with gravity versus against gravity quite so much. But what we can think about here is that I'm going to lay down on my back and I'm going to take a skinny towel roll. So you kind of have to play with the size a little bit to customize it to you. And I'm going to roll up a bit of the towel. So I'm not even going to make it all the way its thickness, but just trying to think of that little bit here. And what that's going to do is that is going to be placed at the lumbar spine and the top of the sacrum. So the idea with this is that if that sacrum is kind of stuck and all glued down together here, we can see how the top of the sacrum tips back and that lumbar spine loses its lordotic curve. So we can use the towel to help restore that lordotic curve, to help push the top of the sacrum forwards and free that tailbone here. So I'm gonna go and lay down here in that 90-90 position, getting nice and close to the wall. So really making sure those knees are over the hips. If someone has tightness in the backside of the pelvis, they might think they're at 90 degrees, but they'll actually be kind of further away. But really having those femurs be vertical can help with this movement. Then I'm going to place this towel roll underneath the backside of the pelvis here. So again, you might have to play with size a little bit and location, but we're thinking about it at that lumbar spine and the top of that sacrum. Now I'm going to drag those heels down, not letting them go anywhere. And that's going to help me feel my hamstrings here. I'm going to use that hamstring engagement to pull my sit bones up through the backside of my knees. And then the top of my pelvis is going to sink back into the ground. So it's really this wheel aspect of sit bones up, hip bones from the front side come sinking straight back. The femurs should remain vertical as best as you can. A lot of time when people are sticky back there, they'll just kind of want to lift up as a whole unit and levitate. So really feeling that rotation under and flattening into the towel is going to help. Now you're going to keep that tension, and now we're going to tip the other way. So now my sit bones are reaching towards the ground. My pelvis is tipping forwards while keeping that hamstring tension. My back's going to arch a little tiny bit at this lumbar spine, not in my ribs flaring here. We should feel those sit bones widen. And then now we're going to tuck back under again. So thinking about this rotation under, abs are along for the ride, hip flexors are along for the ride, glutes are along for the ride as best you can. And then you're going to take it back forwards, keeping that tension. So it's almost like someone's holding your knees here and you're having to reach that tailbone down towards the ground to get that opening in the back of the pelvis. Now, if you have a hard time getting those glutes to relax, you can explore adding in something between your knees to give a little squeeze. That's going to help engage those adductors and can help reciprocally open your glutes. You can kind of think of it as like a teeter-totter of as you squeeze in at your knees, your sit bones should kind of widen. So we can have that little bit of squeeze there, feeling those inner thighs, keeping that squeeze as you go to tuck under and find those hamstrings, and then keeping that squeeze as you go to reach and come back the other way with it. Now, sometimes adding the squeeze can add hip flexors in. So maybe we need to go a little bit wider instead of narrower. Maybe we need to find hamstrings first before adding the adductors in. Maybe we need to do a little bit of other glute opening and other exercises to help that out. But just there to kind of explore and see. That being said, sometimes too, as you rock back and forth in the movement, you can let less glutes into it. So just kind of think about that. That's your intention of trying to get that tuck with hamstrings and without glutes, but maybe we need to go back and forth and rock back and forth or do some other glute opening exercises first before coming back here to make it easier. Now, the other thing I like looking at in this position is the rate at which each side of your pelvis is doing the movement. This can be particularly important for someone that has SI joint pain or pubic symphysis pain. So what we're gonna do here is you're gonna put your hands on your hip bones here, so on these ASIS here, and then we're going to tuck under, finding those hamstrings, and you can feel at what rate your fingertips go back, okay? You might not know at first, so just kind of keep going back and forth between the two and experiment. The more you kind of feel, the better that you'll be able to get a sense of it. But what you might notice is that maybe one side goes a little faster back compared to the other. So that means you need a little bit more hamstrings on that slower side. So in this instance, if I was going to tuck under and my right hip tucked under, my left hip didn't quite go as quickly, we're gonna think about, okay, I need to engage that left hamstring a little bit more to help tuck me under, to catch up to the right side. Okay, so we're feeling for those hip bones to go back equally. Now, when I go forwards, keeping that hamstring tension, reaching through those sit bones, feeling that tailbone come towards the ground, you're feeling for the rate that your pelvis tips forward. Same thing here. So what can happen is maybe one side's a little faster for tucking under, but then the other side's a little faster for tipping forwards. So we need to balance it out. It could be one side stickier in both directions. So maybe we need to put a little bit more effort and energy on that sticky side. We can think about, okay, say my right hip has a little bit of a harder time tipping forwards. I maybe need to sit into that side a little bit more and try to hold back on the left side as best I can. And then we come back up. So the idea is that with each rep, it gets a little cleaner and a little bit more balanced out between the two sides with it. But in the end, you should really feel those hamstrings working, and the back side of your hips and pelvis should be more free to be able to move in other movements and exercises. But again, we can think about how, okay, if I'm going to do that tuck and one side's moving faster, you can see how that creates that twist here at the pubic symphysis, as well as the twist in the SI joint. So getting those two sides to move equally is going to make it for a happier area in both the back and the front. It'll also help set up how other attaching hip muscles will function and drive movement in the pelvis. Now let's go explore one more exercise together as we take this idea into another layer. So our last exercise, we're going to go through a foot elevated hip thrust. Why I really like this is that the elevation of the feet will often help people find a bit more hamstrings. The elevation of the shoulders is going to help take you through more range that the glutes are going to lengthen compared to a bridge. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. That being said, it can be challenging and you might need to break up the individual components, but I find sometimes helping your body kind of show up a little bit more based off of external feedback can really help you think less hard about the movement that we're trying to create. So we're going to be here with my back on the bench and my feet on the box here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to think about sitting down in my hips to start. So as I'm doing this, I'm thinking like I'm a teeter-totter of my back on the bench here. I'm making sure that I don't just drop my hips down and leave my ribs up. So everything comes down together as one unit. Now, as I come up, I'm going to drag my heels back. Think sit bones through backside of knees, knees over midfoot, pubic bone towards head, ribs staying down, because you also don't want people flaring here with it. You can always have a hand behind your head if you need to for a little bit of neck support. And then now you're going to come down using gravity to help you sit back into the hips. So in a sense, it's a hinging pattern, but now we have gravity kind of help you feel that sense of tension that we're trying to lengthen through that can sometimes be hard to create in a standing hip hinge. So we're going to come up again, dragging, feeling that pull, like you're going to pull yourself off the bench, pubic bone up towards head. I'm keeping some of that hamstring tension, almost like I'm thinking about someone pulling my knees as I reach down towards the ground, feeling the backside of that pelvis open and the area here lengthen as well. What we don't want is to come down and stay tucked and round in that lumbar spine. So that's where with someone you might have to think about reaching that sit bone down to help unstick the bottom part of the pelvis and the proximal hamstrings there, and then lifting back up. Again, you can kind of monitor each hip bone and see, do both sit back equally, or do you have to encourage one side a little bit more than the other? And then as you go to come up, do both sides tuck under equally, or does one side want to kind of drive more of the movement and balancing it out there for you? I really like doing it with two legs at first. Then if you go to challenge it further with a single leg, you want to set up well up top, make sure you maintain that position as you pick up a leg, and then lower down one leg at a time, and then again, drive up from there. As you're going to do that, you're making sure that you're not getting kind of wiggles side to side or hip hiking up or hiking down, but keeping that pure movement pattern in that sagittal plane, sitting the hips back and bringing those hips back up and through. So you can kind of see how we build a little bit on finding a little bit of those hamstrings first and getting that pelvis to move forwards and backwards. And then here we take it into, okay, we need hamstrings, but we also need the backside of that pelvis to lengthen and open in more of a glute loaded exercise. So sometimes you kind of play with the order of operations a little bit, where maybe you needed to start with this one to open the back of the pelvis a little bit more, and then come back to the isolated movement of just hamstrings. Other times your pelvis needs more of the stability of those proximal hamstrings in the first moves that we did to then be the grand finale of finishing it here. Another thing to note about that foot elevated hip thrust is sometimes that's an easier position to feel the eccentric lengthening of glutes and hamstrings compared to, say, a deadlift or a hip hinge, because we're able to create active tension and engagement to then feel ourselves eccentrically lengthen against. Sometimes we're in a hip hinge, we have a hard time kind of creating tension to begin with. So it's almost like you're trying to lengthen without having any of that feedback of what you're trying to resist or hold against. That's also why sometimes adding a weight to the hip hinge can help us give a little bit more awareness of where we are in space and what we're working to control against. So just as an aside there, that if you notice someone's just struggling with a hip hinge in general, that could be a great substitute to program over a hip hinge for a little while as they work on improved kind of tone and engagement of those muscles while still being able to take it through its full range. All right, so now it's all about the retest. So go ahead, revisit your hip hinge, revisit your split squat, and see, what does it feel like? What does it look like? Where does the movement feel like it is coming from? Does it feel like that there's kind of greater ease to be able to go through the movement without having to think as hard? Does it feel like you're able to feel more of your glutes and hamstrings doing the work instead of maybe dominating with quads, pinching in the front of the hips, feeling your back working? If that's the case, then great. Those accessory exercises were helpful to keep into the mix to help you get more out of those bigger movements. Now, as we continue to load those bigger movements with improved patterns, then that kind of helps us carry over of being able to break up with the accessory exercises. But at first, we need that little extra WD-40 and connection and awareness to help unstick that area and make sure that each side is showing up like it should be. If you enjoyed some of these ideas in exploring your hips, well, I have great news. We have more for you on that in an entire course. It is our Pelvis Pro Course. It has over 150 research articles that we put into it as we worked on developing the course. We take you through the anatomy and thinking about how to set up different muscles for more success, what exercises you can use to optimize what muscles you're trying to target and get more out of it. We think about taking you into exercise selection based off of assessments. So we have you do certain assessments, and then based off of those assessments, you'll know what to kind of prioritize in your programming to help your clients get what they want out of their movements. We also take this a step further, tying it into special issues. This includes hip impingement, adductor strains, hamstring strains, glute med bursitis, snapping hip syndrome, IT band, all sorts of great things with it. So instead of relying on just a diagnosis on something, we are looking at a movement pattern, okay? And then we're taking you through, here's a sample 1 level exercise for this, Once that is accomplished, we can move on to 2 and 3. Our goal with it is for you to not only understand the philosophy behind the movements and how to get the most out of what you're doing with your clients, but also to help give you direct application and support as you go into weaving it into what you already do with your clients. Too often in continuing education courses, you can come away with great ideas, but then it comes to reality and you don't even know where to start or how to apply it to your population with you. So that is why we have helped you with a general framework of where to go with people based off of the findings. So I hope you'll join us in our Pelvis Pro course to dive into more about what is happening in the hips and pelvis.